Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Context Crime. Today, we're looking at a case out of Argentina from 2023 where we only recently got convictions. It's a case that shook the entire country and exposed truly shocking levels of political corruption. It all started with the late-night visit that turned a family's entire world upside down. One evening in the summer of 2023, two individuals claiming to be police showed up at Gloria Romero's home. They said they were there to let her know that her 28-year-old daughter, Cecilia Strzyzowski, was missing. At first, Gloria didn't believe them. She thought she knew exactly where her daughter was. She was on a trip out of town with her husband. But she would soon discover that everything she'd been told was a lie. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the murder of Cecilia Strzyzowski. Cecilia Marlene Strzyzowski was born in 1994 in Resistencia, the capital of Argentina's Chaco province. She had a younger sister, Angela, and they grew up incredibly close, with Cecilia becoming more of a mother figure to Angela than just a big sister. Their parents separated when the girls were still very young, and they were raised by their mother, Gloria, along with their great aunt, Mercedes. They were a small, tight-knit family of strong women who always supported each other. By the time she disappeared, Cecilia was 28 and working as an administrator at a local health center. But despite her conventional job, she was a creative at heart. She took drawing and sculpture classes, loved choreography, and never missed a chance to get on stage and dance. Cecilia was also an animal lover, especially when it came to dogs. She had 6 of them, and she was very much a dog mom. Her social media was filled with photos of her dogs, and she dreamt of one day opening a shelter for stray animals. This was the type of person Cecilia was: generous and kind, and always looking to help those who needed it the most. But in her personal life, Cecilia was more shy and reserved. She wasn't the party type and seemed happiest at home with her family and pets. She didn't date much, and she had her first boyfriend at 25. But by the end of 2021, Cecilia had come out of that relationship, and she was ready to start a new chapter. She decided to give Tinder a try, and it was there that she met Cesar. On his profile, he went by Alejandro. He was 26, an architect, and he was into tattoos, cats, and memes. He was good-looking, close in age, and they seemed to click almost instantly. But pretty soon, Cecilia found out that he wasn't actually 26. He was in fact 18, and still in high school. And for Cecilia, who was 27 at the time, the age difference came as a complete shock. And of course, being 18, he wasn't an architect either. But Cesar fully owned up to it and claimed he had lied because he was afraid she wouldn't give him a chance if she knew his real age, which was probably a legitimate concern. But by the time Cecilia found out, she already had feelings for him, so the age gap didn't seem like a deal breaker. But not everything was great in their relationship. The two argued a lot, and Cesar could be incredibly immature. He would make plans with Cecilia one day and then simply not show up. He was also jealous of the friendship Cecilia still had with her ex-boyfriend, and that became a recurring source of conflict for the two. But no matter how often they fought, they always seemed drawn back to each other. And less than a year into the relationship, Cesar proposed. When her mom learned about the engagement, she tried to talk Cecilia out of getting married, but she wouldn't hear it. And even though it pained Gloria to see her daughter making what she thought was going to be a big mistake, She still wanted to be supportive. So Gloria even knitted the dress Cecilia wore on her wedding day. The wedding was only 2 weeks after Cesar proposed. Despite their reservations, Cecilia's family stood by her and attended the ceremony. Even her adorable dogs made an appearance. But Cesar's side of the family was conspicuously absent. And this brings us to an important question. Who exactly is Cesar Sena? Because he's no regular Joe. Cesar is the only son of Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuña, a political power couple known locally as the Sena clan. And their rise to prominence is really interesting. Much of the family's wealth and influence traces back to a social/militant movement they started in the early 2000s. This was a turbulent time in Argentina, and a lot of people lost their jobs. Pretty quickly, protests were taking over the country, blocking traffic on major highways for days. Cesar's father, Emerenciano, became involved with these protests early on. He then broke away to form his own faction. But over time, his movement developed something of a reputation for hardline tactics. They would occupy vacant public lands, storm political events. For years, the movement was tolerated, but it was largely on the political fringe, until the governor of Chaco, Jorge Capitanich, thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. That's how the movement was legitimized. Soon, Emerenciano was building his own neighborhood on the lands his picketers had occupied. His legend grew to the point that his own wife wrote his biography called Emerenciano, Leader of the North. But this wasn't really a rags to riches story of a hardworking family, because for years, there were rumors of corruption following the clan. And at the time of Cecilia's disappearance, Cesar's parents were running for office, with Marcela campaigning for mayor of Resistencia. So to say that the sudden, very public disappearance of their daughter-in-law came at a bad time for them is an understatement. But coming back to the wedding, Cesar's parents never approved of his relationship with Cecilia. It seems it all came down to Cecilia being older than Cesar, and also what his parents didn't like was that the two had met on a dating app. Cesar always defended his relationship with Cecilia, but the pressure from his parents to stop seeing her was almost relentless. So he thought that by marrying in secret, his parents would be left with no choice. They would just have to accept her. Fast forward to June 2023, and it seems Cesar's plan had worked. Cesar's mother, Marcela, had used her political connections to find them well-paid jobs in the south of Argentina, in a city called Ushuaia. The move was going to happen soon, so the two planned a short trip down south to work out all the details. The idea was to inspect the house they were going to rent, make sure it was suitable for Cecilia's dogs, sign the lease, and then fly back. This was going to be Cecilia's first time on a plane, and she was both excited and nervous. At the time, she was living with her great aunt, Mercedes, and on June 1st, around 11 p.m., Cesar came to pick her up. The plan was to drive to the nearby city of Corrientes and catch a flight to Ushuaia with a layover in Buenos Aires. 4 days later, on June 5th, Cecilia's mother, Gloria Romero, received that strange late-night visit we started our story with. 2 investigators showed up at her home, telling her a disturbing story. Apparently, they'd received a tip from someone living in the Emerenciano neighborhood, claiming that Cecilia had gone missing. He wouldn't say what had happened or who was involved, only that she was now missing. Gloria's first instinct was that if something bad had happened to Cecilia, then Cesar would also be missing because they were traveling together. She tried calling her daughter, but got no response. She then texted her, saying she would have no choice but to report her missing if she didn't hear back. What happened next was even more disturbing. Gloria received a voice message she immediately recognized. This was an old recording. That specific recording was originally sent to Cesar. What's even more bizarre is that these same two investigators had contacted Cecilia's great aunt, Mercedes, earlier in the evening. But not recognizing them, she refused to let them in. After they left, she called Cesar. He initially told her Cecilia was in Ushuaia, but when she confronted him with the visit from the police, he changed his story, claiming Cecilia had run off with another man when they were in Buenos Aires. After ending the call, he blocked her on WhatsApp. So when Gloria and Mercedes started comparing notes on what each of them had been told, they realized something was terribly wrong. So the next morning, they reported Cecilia missing. But when Gloria went over the details of the night before, authorities were left baffled. They had no active investigations involving Cecilia and no record of any officers being sent to the Romero home. In fact, to this day, no one has been able to identify the two individuals who visited Gloria and Mercedes that night. So Gloria gave police all the information she had about her daughter's plans. She explained the trip to Ushuaia and recounted her last conversation with Cecilia, which took place on the day they left. Mercedes remembered that when Cesar came to pick Cecilia up, he had seemed in a hurry, maybe even a little nervous. But what struck her as odd was that he didn't appear to have any luggage with him, even though they were going to one of the coldest parts of the country. When she asked him about it, he shrugged it off, saying he would just get warmer clothes on the way. She then watched them drive off into the night. Gloria shared another important detail with investigators. Despite planning to relocate together, Cesar and her daughter were actually in the process of getting a divorce. Remember how Cesar's parents never approved of his relationship? Well, it turns out they liked the marriage even less. And according to Gloria, it was Cesar's mother who was actually pushing him to get the divorce. But even that hadn't stopped him from seeing Cecilia. They were still very much a couple. But Cesar being part of the Sena clan definitely raised some scary possibilities. Gloria was concerned about Cecilia's safety, recalling how Cesar would often talk about people hating his family and their politics. He was even known to carry a gun for protection. Another important detail was that after leaving for Ushuaia, all communication between Cecilia and her family suddenly switched to texts. And this was really out of character for Cecilia. She normally preferred video calls, partly because she didn't like Cesar going through her messages, which he tended to do. Another alarm bell was that despite being so excited about the move, Cecilia never sent her mother or her sister a single photo from that trip. So the sudden change of going from calls to texts, coupled with the mysterious visit from the night before, made Gloria fear that something sinister had happened to her daughter. Police agreed, and to their credit, they acted fast. A formal missing person alert was issued along with a public appeal for any information about Cecilia or her whereabouts. The story was picked up by the local media almost overnight, especially since word got out about who Cecilia was married to. But in those first few days, the Sena family couldn't be reached for comment. Then Cesar's aunt, Patricia, took to Facebook to share the family's position. In her post, she lashed out at people smearing their name and accused the public of spreading lies without doing any research. She claimed Cecilia had left with another man and that, in fact, she wasn't married to Cesar. And I don't know if this post was done for optics or if they were going for a show of outrage, but it came off as completely tone deaf. Because Cecilia's family was desperately trying to find her, while the Senas were essentially accusing them of fabricating the marriage. It got to a point where Gloria had to release Cecilia's wedding photos to prove the marriage was real. But the blows to Cecilia's family didn't stop there. Cecilia's ex sent the family screenshots of a text exchange from about a month before she disappeared. And in those messages, Cecilia described an incident in which Cesar physically assaulted her. Apparently, they had an argument and she tried to get out of his car, but he put her in a chokehold and forced her back inside. And you can tell from the text that she was really shaken up and starting to reevaluate the relationship. Her family had no idea that Cesar had ever been violent with her. And then came an even bigger shock. Photos started circulating, showing Cesar in Resistencia on the same day he claimed he was on a plane with Cecilia traveling to Ushuaia. But in reality, he had never left. He was in Resistencia the whole time, meeting people and working the campaign trail. The photos also showed what looked like scratch marks on his neck, which was definitely not a good sign. And it didn't take long for police to confirm that Cecilia never left the province. There was no record of her using public transport. She didn't board any flights. She didn't take any buses or trains. No airline tickets were purchased for either her or Cesar. That trip that she was supposed to be going on, it never existed. Police then took a closer look at the Senas. As they were canvassing the neighborhood, they spotted a neighbor's security camera pointed directly at the family's home. The footage showed Cecilia entering the house on June 2nd, the morning after Cesar picked her up from her great aunt's. Police reviewed every second of that footage, but Cecilia was never seen coming back out. That alone was extremely suspicious, especially since Cesar was the last person she was seen with. So investigators brought him in for questioning along with his mother Marcela and the family's assistant Fabiana Gonzalez. Cesar and Marcela maintained their innocence, and they insisted this was a politically motivated attack. But this next part is what made everyone stop and pay attention, and it was actually the first time when I became aware of this case in 2023. It was through seeing this next video. So here Cesar is seen speaking to reporters as he leaves the police station. He tells them he doesn't know where Cecilia is and says that he is fully cooperated with police. He even hinted at Cecilia having secrets that he promised to keep. I mean, all very cryptic. And then we get to a specific point in the video where he says he's scared that something might happen to Cecilia. And while he's saying that, there's this trace of a smile there. It's really weird. It's a split second. It's there, and then it's gone. And then it happens again, right after. He says, "That's all, I guess." And there's that micro smile again. I'm going to play that for you with audio so you can see it.
Tengo miedo de que le pase algo. Y eso es todo, digamos.
So I was watching this clip back in 2023, knowing nothing about this case. But I remember thinking, that's almost like Duper's delight, you know? And I know people react differently under stress, and he had cameras pointed in his face. But that was interesting to me because it was really at odds with what he was saying. And that clip really made the rounds. It was all over the news and on social media, but he wasn't just losing ground in the court of public opinion. Once they had Cesar's version of events locked in, it didn't take long for investigators to start poking holes in it. In his statement, Cesar claimed that he got into an argument with Cecilia at his parents' house on June 2nd. He said they argued over money. Cecilia got upset, grabbed his wallet and phone, and walked out. But investigators already knew this was a lie because of that neighbor's security camera. It clearly showed Cecilia never left the house. And the secrets he claimed Cecilia was hiding, well, they may have had something to do with these screenshots. He sent this rambling monologue to Cecilia's phone, but she never replied to any of the messages because by that point she was almost certainly no longer alive. In the text, he was begging her to come back before asking her to tell the truth and come clean to her family. He accused her of hitting him and stealing from him. He also reminds her they're no longer married before he accuses her of cheating. Except there was no evidence of anyone else in Cecilia's life. And it seems all this messaging after she disappeared was done to give him a cover story. But one thing he wasn't lying about was the divorce. After Cecilia's disappearance, it came out that the divorce had already been finalized just 3 months after they got married. But married or not, with all the inconsistencies in Cesar's statements, it was enough for a judge to sign a search warrant. On June 9th, 3 days after Cecilia was officially reported missing, police descended on the Senna family home. They impounded multiple vehicles that day and found bloodstains and various rounds of ammunition inside the house. But one thing they didn't find was Cecilia. And given that she went inside and was never seen coming out, the only logical conclusion was that whatever happened to her happened in that house. With no credible explanation from the Sennas about where Cecilia was, police placed Marenciano, Marcella, and their longtime assistant Fabiana Gonzalez under arrest on suspicion of being involved in Cecilia's disappearance. Cesar was their main suspect, and he turned himself in the next day. By this point, there was nonstop coverage of the investigation, and the pressure to find Cecilia was ramping up. So investigators turned their attention to several properties linked to the Senna family. One location in particular stood out as cell tower data showed both Cesar and Cecilia's phones pinging there on the day she disappeared. It was a rural property known as Campo Rossi, the family's pig farm. When police searched the farm, they found fragments of burned bones. This fueled one of the earliest and most disturbing theories in this case, that Cecilia's remains had been fed to the pigs. Gloria later recalled Cesar joking about making bodies disappear that way. But lab testing eventually confirmed the bones were not human, so at least that theory was put to rest. Still, investigators were convinced the farm somehow played a role in Cecilia's disappearance, so they arrested the farm's caretaker, Gustavo Melgarejo, and his wife Griselda Reynoso. Based on movements in and around the Senna home, Gustavo Obregon was also taken into custody. Obregon was the family driver and husband to Fabiana. Soon after, there was another major development. A woman working on the press team of one of Marcella's organizations came forward with new information. Out of nowhere, several members of the Senna family suddenly changed their phone numbers right after Cecilia vanished. This employee was in daily contact with them because of the nature of her work, and she found that really strange. But the real tipping point came when the family instructed her to gather intel about the investigation. essentially asking her to spy on people and find out what they knew. This didn't sit right with her, and when she refused to do that, the threats started coming in. But she wasn't the only one being targeted. Cecilia's mother, Gloria Romero, was doing her best to keep her daughter's case in the spotlight, and her pleas for answers were drawing a lot of attention. She started getting anonymous calls, hinting that her family was being watched. The callers were threatening to harm her other daughter if she didn't stay quiet. But even with 7 suspects in custody, prosecutors were still having trouble figuring out what had happened to Cecilia because at first no one was talking. It was Gustavo Obregon's statement that blew the case wide open. Gustavo Obregon wasn't just the Sena family driver. He was one of Emerenciano's most trusted men. Obregon and his wife Fabiana confirmed what investigators had suspected all along: that Cecilia was killed inside the Sena house on June 2nd. According to Obregon, he received a call from Marcela instructing him to go to the house because Cesar was hurt. She also told him that she'd seen a body inside. When Obregon arrived, only Cesar was at the house. And then going inside the room Marcela had mentioned, Obregon saw the outline of a body wrapped in a blanket. Later that day, Cesar asked Obregon to bring gasoline and meet him back at the house. They loaded Cecilia's body into the bed of Cesar's truck and drove separately to the farm to avoid coming up on the same security cameras. At the farm, Obregon went to find the caretaker. When he came back, Cesar had already dragged Cecilia's body onto a pile of wood. Obregon watched as he set her on fire. They spent the next few hours tending to the flames, but Cesar didn't seem too bothered by where they were or what they were doing. He was chatty and making plans about playing pool. Obregon also remembers that Cesar had 2 cell phones on him. He would text on one and then switch to the other. This confirms that it was Cesar messaging Cecilia's family after June 2nd. Investigators managed to recover Cecilia's charred suitcase. They also found partially burned clothing and several pieces of jewelry, including some rings. One of them looked identical to Cecilia's engagement ring. You can see it in this Instagram post she shared right after Cesar proposed. That's him holding her hand, by the way. What makes this even more heartbreaking is her family later shared she never took that ring off. It meant so much to her that she wouldn't take it off even in the shower. It's just unbelievably heartbreaking that anyone could do this to her, let alone someone she loved that much. Investigators also found crushed bone fragments and small personal items in the area where Obregon had indicated. There was a small bottle of perfume, cosmetics, and a cross-shaped pendant that was quite distinctive, and it matched the necklace Cecilia is seen wearing in these photos. This time, forensic anthropologists managed to confirm that the bone fragments were human. But unfortunately, because of the extensive fire damage, no formal identification was possible. And that was a serious setback for prosecutors, but they were still gathering tons of circumstantial evidence. Feeling more and more isolated, Cesar met with a priest. And like everything else in this case, that conversation became public. According to the priest, Cesar never spoke of Cecilia as if she were still alive. The closest he came to offering an explanation was saying that things had gotten out of hand after an argument. He claimed he didn't know what happened next because he had stepped out, which seemed to imply that someone else was responsible. And he seemed very angry at Marcela specifically, but not at his father. And speaking of his parents, they initially refused to say anything. But when they realized this wasn't going away, they agreed to give statements. Emerenciano just denied having any knowledge or involvement in Cecilia's death. That was it. But Marcela had a lot more to say. It seems she was throwing Cesar under the bus. In her account of that day, she returned home and found him agitated and upset. She asked him what had happened, but he just mentioned an argument with Cecilia. She later noticed that one of the bedrooms that was always locked was left ajar, and she went inside and saw what she described as a lump wrapped in a blanket. Marcella said she was so horrified by what she had seen that she didn't know what to do. She didn't confront Cesar and didn't call the police. She and Emerenciano left for a planned event. The only thing she could think of doing was sending for Obregon. Based on Marcella's new testimony, police returned to the house for a more thorough search. This time, crime scene techs found wiped bloodstains inside the room where Marcella claimed she saw the body. Out in the yard, they found the charred remains of a backpack and a burnt wallet. They also discovered that the Senas had donated a bed frame, a mattress, and some couches to a family living in the same neighborhood. Testing confirmed there was human blood on the mattress that was later matched to Cecilia. The evidence was overwhelming, but the question was, how did we get there? From a couple that seemingly loved each other and were taking on the entire world just so they could be together. How did it end with Cecilia dead? Well, some very unsettling details about Cesar started coming to light. He had often posted about being miserable. He compared his life to that of a prisoner, never allowed to meet kids his own age or leave the house without his parents or his personal security. In his posts, he talked about the hostility that his parents' politics and activism were attracting. It seems that for much of his life, he had felt lonely and isolated. So it's probably no surprise he had a lot of pent-up frustration. And in his case, that turned into rebellion on steroids. He went on Tinder, he met Cecilia, he started dating her despite his parents' disapproval, and even married her without telling anyone. But his independence didn't last long. And that brings us to his relationship with his mother, Marcella, which was intense, to say the least. In one of his posts, he called her the most special woman in his life. And Marcella literally has his face tattooed on her arm. I want to say that's endearing, but I somehow can't. According to Cecilia's family, Marcella resented her presence in Cesar's life, and it almost felt like the two were competing for his attention. Marcella was so possessive that she would call him at all hours of the day or night and expect him to just drop everything and come and see her. In one specific incident that happened on the day they got married, Marcella sent a driver to pick Cesar up so he wouldn't spend the night with his new bride. She literally sabotaged their wedding night. But it seems Cesar might have been going through even deeper personal struggles. At one point, he told Cecilia that he was questioning his sexuality, and she encouraged him to see a therapist. He was eventually prescribed medication to manage his temper. Around that time, Cecilia also learned that during one of his outbursts, he had actually hit Marcella. And hindsight is 20/20, but looking back, it seems that Cesar was spiraling and his parents either missed the signs or they couldn't or wouldn't admit he had a problem. But while his behavior was increasingly volatile, prosecutors believed Cecilia's murder wasn't just something that happened in the heat of the moment. The story about relocating to Ushuaia, that was completely fabricated. There were no plane tickets, no job offer, and no house waiting for them. There was nothing, zilch. And according to prosecutors, this entire narrative was designed to lure Cecilia to her former in-laws' house. This was a plan set in motion weeks earlier. So in May 2023, Cesar first floated the idea of moving south. The offer was too good to say no to, so Cecilia jumped at the opportunity. On June 1st, they checked into a hotel. Investigators later recovered surveillance footage showing them leaving early the next morning. They're seen walking out of the hotel, and Cecilia looks happy and relaxed. She's laughing as they climb into Cesar's truck. The neighbor's security camera then shows Cesar pulling up at his parents' house at 9:15. Cecilia is seen carrying her suitcase inside. This is the last confirmed image of her alive. Cesar leaves the house briefly before returning around noon. He is alone with Cecilia until 12:16 p.m., when his parents also come in. From that moment until 1:01, all three Senas were inside the house with Cecilia, and this is when prosecutors say she was killed. At 1:01 p.m., Cesar leaves the house alone, but geolocation data showed Cecilia's phone was traveling with him. Later that afternoon, Marcela and Emerenciano departed for a planned event. Shortly afterwards, Gustavo Obregon and Fabiana Gonzalez are seen entering the house. And at 7:27 p.m., Obregon and Cesar load Cecilia's body into the truck and take it to the Sena farm, where her remains were burned. Over the next 2 days, Cesar appeared at campaign events in Resistencia. All this time, text messages from Cecilia's phone drip-fed an itinerary she was never actually on. Her family, eagerly waiting for updates, believed she had safely reached Ushuaia. Prosecutors were convinced the Sena family had orchestrated the plot to make Cecilia disappear, confident their power and connections would shield them from any accountability. And even though the animosity between Cecilia and her in-laws was well documented, there might have been a financial motive for her murder. Because despite a marriage that had lasted less than 3 months, Marcela reportedly offered Cecilia a generous settlement in exchange for signing the divorce papers. An interesting nuance here is that part of that divorce settlement included helping Cecilia and Cesar open a cafe together. And they did. Here's Cecilia in a promotional segment talking about the business. But the cafe closed after only a few months, and there might have been an interesting backstory there. This is all alleged, but according to Cecilia's family's lawyer, Cesar wanted to use the cafe to launder money. Cecilia was furious and flat out refused to have anything to do with this. We don't know how far that conflict went, but we do know from both Cesar and Marcela's statements that an argument over money took place on the day Cecilia was killed. All 3 members of the Sena family were indicted as co-conspirators in Cecilia's murder. Cesar was singled out as the de facto killer. His parents were charged as his accomplices. The 4 Sena associates were charged with aggravated cover-up for their role in cleaning up and disposing of Cecilia's remains. The trial for Cecilia's murder started in October 2025, more than 2 years after her disappearance. Over several weeks, prosecutors presented forensic evidence and called dozens of witnesses to support their central theory that Cecilia was killed as part of a coordinated conspiracy led by Cesar and his parents. Prosecutors put a lot of emphasis on the control Cesar's parents had over his life, suggesting that he most likely acted under their influence. A digital forensics expert presented Cecilia's internet search history in the days and hours before she disappeared. She Googled things like, what can I pack in my carry-on? And is a passport required to travel in Argentina? She searched for the 15 best chocolate shops in Buenos Aires and where she could get the best coffee. Just the kinds of searches you'd expect from someone excited about an upcoming trip. Her final recorded activity was at 10:07 a.m. on June 2nd, about an hour after she entered the Sena house. Then the jury got to hear Cesar's searches. As Cecilia was looking up coffee places in Buenos Aires, Cesar was searching for videos on how to dislocate an arm and how to break a wrist. After Cecilia's death, he looked up, do killers feel remorse? What happens to the soul of a loved one who dies violently? He also searched for Mind of a Killer, violent death, what happens to the soul? The court also heard directly from Emerenciano and Marcella. Emerenciano spent most of the trial hiding his face behind just about anything he could get his hands on. I honestly have no idea what's going on there. But his attorneys insisted he barely knew Cecilia and claimed he only learned about his son's marriage and later the divorce when he got arrested. He firmly denied knowing anything about Cecilia's disappearance and maintained that on the day she was killed, he went about his business as usual and never deviated from his normal routine. When Marcella spoke before the jury, she stopped just short of naming Cesar as the killer, but she strongly implied it. She didn't deny covering for him, but claimed she did it because she loves him. She denied there was a conspiracy to kill Cecilia and claimed that after she found out about what had happened, she deliberately kept Emerenciano in the dark to prevent him from going to the police, which is probably what she should have done. In her hour-long statement, she asked Gloria Romero for forgiveness and claimed her relationship with Cecilia had been misrepresented. She said she actually liked her precisely because she was older and more mature, and she denied having any reason to want her dead. Make of this what you will. But the jury didn't buy the excuses of the defense and found 6 of the 7 defendants guilty. Cesar, Emerenciano, and Marcella were all convicted of aggravated homicide in Cecilia's death. Gustavo Obregon and Fabiana Gonzalez were found guilty of aggravated concealment. Gustavo Melgarejo was convicted of simple concealment but released on parole after he'd already served 2/3 of the maximum sentence. Griselda Reynoso was the only defendant acquitted of all charges. In February of this year, the court sentenced the 3 members of the Sena clan to life in prison. Obregon received 5 years and 10 months, and Fabiana Gonzalez was sentenced to 5 years. Now that the trial is over, Cecilia's remains will finally be released for burial. Cecilia's family welcomed the verdicts, but for them, this is no victory. They've lost a daughter, sister, and granddaughter. They cling to every memory they have of Cecilia, and they still care for her beloved dogs. But Cecilia's case became much bigger than one family's tragedy. What began as the missing persons case quickly turned into a national reckoning over political power and impunity in Argentina. Thousands marched alongside Gloria, demanding justice for Cecilia. And through it all, one image has endured, that of a mother who refused to be silent. Despite numerous threats and dealing with unimaginable grief, Gloria never stopped fighting, not just for Cecilia, but for every family still seeking justice. That's all for today's case. Thanks for sticking around till the end, and see you in the next one.